Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes academic discussion of literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Good evening.
Hey.
Today we are reviewing the last book in our series about contemporary utopias, The Dispossessed by Ursula Guin. For this series, we also discussed Toni Morrison's Paradise and Mike Resnick's Kirinyaga, which you can find in our archives. If this is your first time joining us, our weekly podcast is structured around different series wherein we explore some theme, genre, or setting. Each series is composed of 3 books and takes about 10 weeks. If you'd like to join our extended discussion, you can find a link to our literary book club subreddit in our episode description, and we are also on social media at Canonical Pod. So Sam, this was your pick for our series. Why did you choose this book, besides the fact that I peer pressured you into choosing this book? But why else did you choose this book?
Like so many of my picks, I picked Le Guin because she was this big blind spot for me. I'd only read a single short story of hers, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and I've always wanted to read more of her. This book, The Dispossessed, is a 1974 science fiction novel by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it's set in the fictional universe of 7 novels that make up the Hainish cycle, of which one of her other big novels, The Left Hand of Darkness, is a part of. This book won the Hugo, Locus, and Nebula Awards for Best Novel in 1975. It achieved a degree of literary recognition unusual for science fiction due to its exploration of some big themes such as anarchism and revolutionary societies, capitalism, and individualism versus collectivism. Le Guin is a celebrated writer of science fiction, fantasy, and more. Even people who may not be familiar with her other work might be familiar with her Earthsea cycle, which is fantasy, or the short story I mentioned before, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which has some similar utopian themes.
Another thing I think that's really interesting is that there is an amount of anthropological depth to this novel that I think is remarkable. And it makes sense because her father, Alfred Lewis Kroeber, he was an anthropologist at UC Berkeley. So I think there's definite maternal influence coming from the father in this one.
This book centers around Shevik, a member of the anarchic collectivist civilization on the desert satellite planet called Anarres, which orbits Urus, which is more Earth-like both in how verdant and varied inland it is, but also in its different statist civilizations, some of which are more capitalist, some socialist of a sort. It takes place 150 years after a major revolution led by Leia Odo, which resulted in the Odonians leaving Urus to settle on Anarres. Shevik is a theoretical physicist working on an idea called simultaneity, which is a polarizing idea that scares some of his peers while exciting others for the prospect of power. And through him, through Shevik, we see the benefits and costs of these very different societies. I think also worth noting is that this story is told in 2 main, mostly linear progressions, where after the first chapter, which is about Shevik leaving Anarres, the odd chapters are about what happens on Urus, and the even chapters are about his life growing up on Anarres.
I have to say, at first, I did not enjoy these alternating chapters because I thought all of the interesting stuff was happening on Urus, and the Anarres chapters were kind of boring. Later on, I felt that there was more parody. They became more equally interesting, but at the beginning of the novel, I was like, man, why can't it all just be Urus all the time?
Interesting. I don't know if I agree, but I kind of understand, because a lot of what happens on Anarres is not quite exposition, but it's explaining how the society functions. I think she does it well. She tries to do it not as exposition, but there are times when it does come across that way.
Well, I think the earnest chapters have this obvious fish out of water sort of appeal. It's easy to understand why the situation is tense and why it's interesting. Whereas the value of the Anarres chapters comes with how they fill in all of the philosophical detail about how their society works and how it's different from Urus. And that doesn't seem as interesting or important at first, to me at least.
This will come up in another discussion when we talk about time, but I think the reason she does it this way, or at least one reason, is because it mimics his idea of simultaneity versus sequency, where you've got linear motion through time, but you've also got a return. You've got this circular
Yeah.
motion.
That makes sense. At the end of the novel, I was okay with this structure, but it was just at the beginning, I was a little bit let down by all of the Anarres chapters. I was like, man, these are kind of boring.
For me, the first chapter set on Anarres, which is chapter 2, was kind of dull because it takes place when he was a child, and all it does is a lot of foundational work for the ideas that she extrapolates later on. But I think that was the only slow chapter, because what worked really well for me is it's not just the fact that the structure mirrors simultaneity and this idea of cycles. The chapters also play off of each other. There's one chapter where he makes sexual advances toward a woman on Earth, and the very next chapter is about his courtship and subsequent marriage to his wife. And the two work thematically because, by contrast, you can see exactly what the differences are. And for me, that worked really well. So I wouldn't want a book that focused only on Urus. I think the structure is one of the stronger parts of this book for me.
There's another section like the one you're talking about. I think they're back to back, where he describes the children, Shevik and his friends, trying to work through what a jail is. And I think at that point, the next chapter after that, when he's on Urus, he goes by
a fort that was the prison of Odo.
Right. And he's reflecting on it and how grotesque of a thing it is to still be there.
Could that be accomplished with flashback? Do we need to have an entire chapter for each of these parallels?
That seems like a lot of flashback.
I think the way it's set up here is it creates this balance because these two planets, it's described as a moon, but I've also seen other people say that it's actually just two planets that are kind of orbiting each other. So I don't know which is right. But I think it creates this balance between the two, that he is a man who is not just between worlds, but belonging to neither. And I think that balance is important.
I'm not speaking here from like a thematic concern or even an artistic concern, just from appreciating the novel as entertainment. Like, if we set aside all other concerns, I would be more entertained with a different structure. But I do agree that it works thematically and perhaps artistically to have it balanced, because I think that devoting an equal amount of time to his life on Anarres allows Le Guin more opportunity to explore some of the themes, such as why he chose to leave in the first place, which I think are very important. And it would be very difficult to get through all of that before you get to the second half of the novel, where more of the action happens when he's actually left Anarres.
Right. Well, and then it becomes more of a story about action versus a story with different philosophical ideas going on, too. Like, if you're trying to do all of that linearly through flashback or whatever else, I think the exposition would probably be less cohesive, I guess. It'd probably stand out more.
Yeah, typically I'm more nitpicky when it comes to, elements of fiction and craft, but for me, actually, I wouldn't change almost anything in this book. I think, I'm not going to say it's perfect because I think it has some flaws, but I think in terms of what this book is, I would describe it as an example of science fiction at its finest. For me, the pinnacle of science fiction is this book. The way she presents ideas that are both alien but also urgent to contemporary life. And she is able to do this with few missteps. We talked about the structure and how I think the structure reflects the ideas of the novel. I think the characters are believable, though kind of flat, but that's acceptable because this novel doesn't focus on drama. Its focus is on the ideas. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is like a very ambitious novel that kind of hits everything a science fiction reader wants. I think this book is for someone who's serious about science fiction and who wants to read science fiction as literature. For me, there's just really not another book that hits all the notes exactly right.
I think I agree.
Well, I agree that this is a very good novel, but I don't know if I would say that it is the pinnacle, as you have said. I wouldn't say it's uncommonly good, because here I'm thinking even back to our series on transhumanist science fiction. Like, I think that Werner Vinge's A Fire Upon the Deep is equal to this in terms of exploring ideas. And I think just in terms of the novelty and interest that those ideas offer, that was even stronger than this, because while I do think that anarchism is very well presented and explored in this novel, the ideas about the simultaneity in A Fire Upon the Deep were even more groundbreaking to me.
Yeah, for me, that book had more flaws in its construction. It definitely was not written as well as this book in terms of language and also structure. You know, we talked in that book about how the plot had like multiple climaxes, which are good in some contexts, but not in books.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean when I say that this is science fiction at its finest, because it's not just about science or ideas, it's also about fiction. And I think this book nails that aspect of it. It moves toward a climax and kind of fusion at the end that makes sense in the context of what the book is exploring.
I think, too, it does something that so much science fiction is not able to do, which is bring ideas that actually matter to our actual conversations here on Earth.
Yeah. It's hard to say because science fiction is often in the clouds, pun intended, I suppose. But this is something that is seemingly more pressing, I guess, because we are living in a very political time. Another thing I want to heap praise on here is I think her world building is very ambitious, and it's something I've criticized previous writers for not doing. For example, Paolo Bacigalupi in The Wind-Up Girl, and to a lesser extent, Mike Resnick in the last book we read in Kirinyaga, where they never really leave Earth behind. Le Guin, even though she's taking very real political conflicts, she's creating two new worlds and kind of a third, an alternate reality Earth that's also present in the book briefly. Like, that is very impressive to me, and it's something that I really wish more writers would do.
Yeah, I agree. We've talked about this before, but even when the characters are dealing with very similar situations that we're dealing with on Earth, there's not really a need to center it on Earth, especially if you're dealing with differences in race or gender, things that are going to get you into trouble if you're trying to make broad generalizations. But if you're taking it and placing the story in a different world entirely, you can kind of make up the rules as much as you want.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think perhaps we could even argue because as a person of color, being a person of color is important to how the world works and is experienced. But at the same time, I appreciate that this is constructed around a pure thought exercise where you do remove these other cultural factors and it is focused on the pure thought exercise.
That, to me, I'm not so sure I can agree with you. Yes, I do think that if a writer is able to successfully leave Earth and Earth concerns behind and create something coherent and engaging just from pure imagination, that's wonderful and commendable. But I do think that, first of all, it might not be the case with this novel, because I do think a lot of it is in direct response to the Vietnam War. But even if we set that aside, why would being disconnected from the concerns of our reality as readers be valuable? Like, yes, it's good that a writer can have such a wonderful imagination that she can create something brand new, but engaging with the concerns of our real world isn't necessarily something that I find problematic.
It's not so much doing away with everything on Earth, it's the framing of it. So the reason Bacigalupi was a problem was because he was presuming to speak for various different races of people. She wouldn't have to have done away with race as a concept. And she kind of goes over a little bit on Urus, but only a little bit. But the difference is she doesn't have to presume to speak for another race of people if she creates her own. She can talk about the same problems without saying, I speak for these people.
I mean, I do agree with you, Iad, in that I think there is something to be said for science fiction that is more intimately connected with reality and portraying reality more closely. But I think there's also something to be said for the other side of that coin, where you have a world that is almost entirely hypothetical, kind of an alternate reality world, where you have fertile ground for a thought exercise. I think science fiction can hold both. And for me, I would commend both. What I hate is being in the middle ground or when it's done clumsily. So, yeah, you thought that the structure didn't work for you that well, especially at the beginning. Broadly speaking, for both of you, did you find there to be any technical flaws in the novel? Anything that stood out to you?
This is something that we came up against when we were talking about our series on philosophical novels. And we had a discussion in the past on whether philosophical ideas were better suited for straight ahead fiction or for science fiction. And it comes up again here in this novel, which is the address of philosophical concerns from people speaking as normal people in a world. It just feels often a little bit doe-eyed. It feels a little bit embarrassingly earnest. This is something especially I recall from our Chinese science fiction series when we reviewed Vagabonds, a novel that we all hated, but which I think is similar in a lot of ways to The Dispossessed. When you have a group of people speaking very earnestly about big issues, it feels very earnest, and there's no way to get around that, because even in real life, when you sit down with somebody and you talk about very big issues, you feel sorry for yourself. You feel embarrassed to talk about it sometimes because you recognize often how ridiculous it is to spend so much time thinking about these things. But to read about it in fiction, you encounter that same feeling, or at least I did.
Yeah, I'd say that I was okay with a lot of it, even though some of the dialogue is earnest in that way that you say. But there are some scenes that stood out to me as particularly uh, odd, I guess.
I feel conflicted because I agree that, like I said before, the characters do come off as flat sometimes, and that's one of the reasons why. But on the other hand, this is in the long tradition of utopian novels that all do this, because the focus of a utopian novel is on the idea and the place. The focus is less on the character. The character is, the stranger in the strange land. So because it's working in this tradition, I'm more prone to let it slide because I know as a reader that's what I expect when I read a novel that's purporting to be a utopia. All right, let's pause for a break. When we come back, we'll talk about how relevant this book is today, 50 years after it's been published. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So this book was written nearly 50 years ago. Do you think this book is still relevant today?
Yeah, I think it's still relevant, but it does feel dated to me. The feminism, her brand of feminism, especially feels dated to me.
I think that there are some things that come from this book being written 50 years ago that are noticeably strange, like the fact that they are traveling from planet to planet, but they still read books and write on paper. Like that sort of thing, it seems like a lack of foresight, but that just comes with science fiction, I think. Like you just learn to look past those small differences. It's not really that important, I would say. And they do have computers because Shevek in his room on Uris has a desk computer. Not sure exactly how the desk computer works, but he has a computer.
Right. He does talk about on Anarres how they don't use paper that much, right? Where paper and clothes and things like that are very important commodities, so they don't overuse things.
Right. On Anarres, it makes sense because those guys don't have shit. But on Uris, it's described as like this land of technological wonder.
You know, it's kind of like one of those Star Trek episodes where they land on an alien planet and everyone's dressed like they're in the Renaissance, but they also have advanced technology. That's how I understood it.
Right.
What about anarchism itself? Because that's really central to this novel. Like, a lot of people in the world seem to be craving some sort of a radical politics, but do you think anarchism is important to people now?
I think anarchism is pretty dead now, which is a shame because I actually am quite sympathetic to it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is pretty dead, though this brand of anarchism, maybe not on a grand scale, but I can see people wanting similar things on a smaller scale here.
Well, just the general conversation around something like anarcho syndicalism, I think, was a much more popular topic among academics. People interested in ideas were actively discussing ideas like mutualism in the 70s, whereas now I think the world has just moved toward a much more authoritarian ideology, and everyone just kind of accepts it more now.
Yeah. I do see discussions of mutualism coming up today, but it's not quite what Le Guin is doing here.
I mean, if you don't look at all the sovereign citizen crazies,
Right?
I mean, mutualism is like you and your friend buying a house together because you're too poor to buy a house on your own, aka my plan with you, Sam.
Yes, I gotcha.
That to me is how like mutualism is popularly discussed now among millennials, anyway.
The idea that anarchism might be dead or mutualism might be dying, does that mean that this novel should be forgotten in terms of its political impact, or does that mean that we need this novel more than ever?
I mean, I'm very sympathetic to to libertarian socialism or anarcho syndicalism, so I'd argue for the latter, but I'm pretty biased.
I think it's needed, but it might be needed as a jumping off point for something newer.
Like, sign me up for that Anarres life, you know? Go send me to the desert to plant some plants and get that dust cough. all about it.
I don't think that the goal of the novel is really to persuade people that anarchism is good. It's not the sort of political position that people are unaware of and people have nothing to say about. But I think most people are just generally unsympathetic to anarchism. They think it's ridiculous. So I think that for people to be swayed, any type of text has to be very, very persuasive. And I just don't think that this is the novel to do that.
I, as someone, like I said, who's very sympathetic to anarchism, I don't think that I would read this book and be convinced by it. But I think what it does do is it opens doors and it starts conversations, because the first step is to question the default, the status quo. And that's what this book does, is it presents the status quo of capitalism and authoritarianism as worthy of being questioned. I think there are a lot of people who just never even question it. They just think, well, I have to live this lifestyle. I have to buy my own house. I have to work until I get this. And that's what this book does. Is it doesn't make you into an anarchist, but it makes you question whether or not you should be a capitalist, and if that is the only solution to the problems of the world. So I didn't read this book in school, and I'm guessing you guys didn't read Le Guin either, but it is part of the canon. People do write about the Dispossessed. Do you think that this book, because we talked about how it might be dated, do you think it should still be part of the canon?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think even if the characters are a bit flat and there is a dated quality to a lot of it, I still think it's very well written. The qualities that you were just talking about, how it opens the doors to certain conversations, is important. And I don't know that many books, that many novels, I should say, that do that for these topics.
If anything, I think it's valuable as a historical document. It's a picture of the American left in the mid 70s. And I think that because it's a very well realized picture of a certain outlook, I think that alone is valuable.
I would love for this to be required freshman reading in college. I don't think it would, because just think about all the complaints it would get from, people who love capitalism
Mm-hmm.
and hate communists and whatever. But I would love for this to be freshman reading. I think it's something that, even if you're not an anarchist, I think it's something that's important for people to think about when they are entering college and entering adulthood.
I don't think it ever would be, but I think this could even be taught at the high school level.
Yeah, I thought about that. I just think it would never be taught in high school. Like, people would be lining up to burn this book.
Yeah.
All right, we'll conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review of the book, you can let us know on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That's in the episode description as well. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a review on Apple or subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. We'll be back next week and the week after with a discussion of the Dispossessed. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.